At the present time, this moment seems so far away. The moment when we board the Starship and get ready to explore the solar system or have it take us wherever we want to go, whether that place be Mars, or perhaps to explore the clouds of Venus, or perhaps to the moon, or to the asteroids, or perhaps to serve some other commercial purpose. But are there some other practical purposes that the Starship could be put to? Well, of course, we've talked a lot about those sorts of things on this channel. We've talked about building huge presences in low Earth orbit to occupy low Earth orbit with space stations and satellites and Starlink constellations and God knows what else. It's an amazing future that we're looking at, but we can look bigger still. Of course, the Starship gives us the capacity to build enormous space stations or to mine extremely rich asteroids like 16 Psyche that have insane amounts of mineral wealth. But there's even more wealth to be had in the solar system, something the Starship could help us to exploit, and something that could make whatever company is successful in taking advantage of it ridiculously rich. And although the mineral wealth of the asteroid belt and elsewhere in the solar system is something our civilization desperately needs, this ball of hydrogen and helium that fuses every second of every minute of every hour of every day is something that our civilization needs even more. And I'm not talking about the fact that it sustains life on every planet that might harbor life throughout the solar system. And by the way, I think there's life beyond Earth in this solar system, but we can talk about that in another episode. No, I'm talking about something else that it provides, something that could be vital to the future of our civilization and our planet, and the Starship could be instrumental in helping us take advantage of that. How? Well, we're going to find out in just a few minutes. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Angry Astronaut. And I always say something special. There always seems to be something special to celebrate. But in this case, it's a big deal. 30,000 subscribers. I continue to be just awed and blown away on a regular basis by how many folks watch my channel and like it enough to subscribe. I mean, I've been at it for less than a year on this. It's amazing. I never would have imagined it, not even close. And it's been because of my supporters, those who have stuck with me and have spread the word and have told other people about what I do, and they're all across the planet. So thank you very much for that. And as a result, we need to have a special episode, something big and something about the Starship. But instead of traditional things about the Starship, as in where might it take us, or what kind of benefits could it bring us from asteroid mining, or putting up huge numbers of satellites, or even Starlink. I want to think even bigger than that. And I've talked briefly about this topic in the past, but I want to go into more detail. And this is about powering the human species, our entire civilization. And I think a lot of you can guess that I'm talking about solar power in space. And there is just so much benefit to it. But what's held us back for so long is the cost per kilogram of putting things into orbit. But the Starship is going to change all of that, putting not only huge amounts of mass into orbit for a very low price, but also doing it on a very regular basis. Elon claims 3 launches a day. But even if we were only to do it once every day or two, imagine the number of solar panels that could be put into orbit, the solar arrays that could be built, and the energy that they could generate, because they generate so much more energy in space, as you're about to see, than they generate down here on the Earth. And yet, in spite of all the obvious benefits that have been apparent to us since Isaac Asimov was writing some of his earliest books, we still haven't done anything about it, not even anything really experimental. And yet there is somebody who's about to put the first space-based solar array into orbit. And once you find out who it is, you're going to get as pissed as I am. So let's get started right now. When you're talking about the subject of harnessing the sun's energy, or even a small percentage of it in space, you can't really do that without discussing this guy. His name was Nikolai Kardashev, and he died just last year in 2019. And he defined civilizations by how much energy that they were able to harness, namely the energy of the sun that their planet orbited. Now, if a civilization was able to harness all of the energy that struck their planet, every bit of it, that would be a Kardashev Level 1 civilization. Now, if a civilization was sufficiently advanced to encase their own star in something called a Dyson sphere and harness all of that energy, that would be a Kardashev Level 2 civilization. And then there would be godlike civilizations that could encase all the stars in an entire galaxy, and that would be a Kardashev Level 3 civilization. There are levels above that, but it gets even more ridiculous than this, so I think we'll just stick with the 3 levels that Kardashev originally came up with. Now, Carl Sagan once defined human civilization as being a 0.7 civilization, and that's recently been increased to 0.72 or so, but I think that's entirely too generous. You see, a total of 173,000 terawatts worth of solar energy strikes the Earth on a continuous basis. That's more than 10,000 times the amount of energy that the world produces. And of course, that's completely renewable energy as well. We can conceive of that kind of energy, but harnessing it? Well, to call us a Kardashev type 01 civilization would be a little generous by that scale. But if you put large solar arrays in space, that starts to change the scale in our favor. Solar panels produce 40 times as much power in space as they do on Earth. And that's because, number one, the atmosphere, and number two, if they're in geosynchronous orbit, they are in the sunlight 99.9% of the time. But no amount of efficiency could make up for the fact that the space shuttle cost $54,500 per kilogram to get something to low Earth orbit. And even the Falcon 9, which is way more efficient, still costs $2,720 per kilogram. And that's just to low Earth orbit, not geosynchronous orbit, which is where the best location is for space-based solar arrays. According to NASA's most recent studies, space solar power will not be economically viable until recurring launch costs drop down to $100 to $200 per kilogram. And guess what? This is where the Starship comes into play in a huge way. If Elon Musk's estimate of $2 million per launch turns out to be true, that means the Starship can transport cargo at $20 per kilogram to low Earth orbit. And even if it requires a refueling in order to get up into geosynchronous orbit, that's still only $40 per kilogram. And even if it ends up being double what he says it's going to be, it's still an extremely viable cost. The Starship will change everything about space-based solar power and make the whole concept not only feasible, but incredibly profitable. So how would all of this work? Well, you can cheat, first of all, by using an origami-like technique as they're developing at Brigham Young University to deploy the solar panels in smaller packages and then have them unfold once deployed. This makes for a much larger area of coverage and therefore considerably more solar energy. And here's a series of diagrams created by the incomparable Cyclonics, who helps me on a lot of my work on this channel, illustrating how these origami-like solar panels would be stacked inside the Starship's fairings, how many you could fit inside it, and how they would be deployed. Once unfolded, each of these gigantic origami solar arrays would be 80 meters in diameter, and you could fit 18 of them in the Starship's fairings, plus one microwave transmitter, and we'll talk about that later. But here's the important part. 8 of these would be sufficient to power all of New York City. In other words, 8 Starship launches powers all of New York. Now, to get this kind of extraordinary energy, you need to cheat a little bit more. You need an array of mirrors above the solar panels to concentrate the sun's energy onto them further. If you are able to do that, it increases the amount of energy that the panels generate many-fold. In our particular case, 2.5 gigawatts per array. Now, let's say deploying those mirrors requires another 8 launches. That means 16 total Starship launches, or $32 million, if Elon's figures are to be believed, could power all of New York. $32 million for the transportation. If the Starship becomes operational, or rather when it does, the cost of sending solar panels into space no longer becomes the most expensive part of this system. But how do you get the energy from the panels down to the Earth? Well, that's where the transmitter comes into play. Solar panels convert photons into electrons, and then a space-based solar panel would convert those electrons into high-frequency radio waves, which would then be transmitted down to the Earth. These microwaves, in turn, would be received by something called a rectenna down on the surface, which would be like a field full of wires sticking up. The rectenna elements would receive incoming radio waves and then convert those microwaves into electricity, transmitting said electricity to New York or whatever city you wanted to supply. Now, granted, building all that infrastructure, the panels, the mirrors, the transmitters, the rectennas, all of that would cost quite a lot of money. But if you consider that the operating revenues of the New York Power Authority is $2.5 billion a year just for one city, that's actually quite a lot of money to build that infrastructure, and then you get the energy essentially for free afterwards. And think of the huge number of jobs that would be created by building such an infrastructure in the first place. And the jobs would be ongoing. You would need to be constantly producing new panels, new mirrors, new equipment to replace ones that either wore out or were damaged by micrometeoroids in space. So let's review. The Starship transports both the mirrors and the solar panels, plus the transmitters, into geosynchronous orbit. These transmit electrical energy in the form of microwaves down to a receiving station on Earth, and that is in turn converted into electrical energy and transmitted by means of conventional wires to a city. Pretty straightforward. It just wasn't practical when going into space was so expensive. In the future, we could also manufacture photovoltaic cells on the lunar surface just out of moon rocks and transport it at 1/10 the delta V to low Earth orbit, making the whole process even more efficient, plus expedite man's expansion into space. And even though the current cost per kilogram is not cost effective, it's low enough to where we could start experimenting with small solar arrays with the intention of eventually expanding them once we have the Starship operational. Really, we should be building these test arrays right now using vehicles like the Falcon Heavy. But we aren't. Instead, somebody else is planning to do it. And I'll give you 3 guesses as to who that is. Yep, no big surprise there. The communist Chinese, who are investing billions of dollars in green energy, intend to have a functioning test plant in orbit in 5 years and a full-fledged solar farm in orbit by 2050. Whereas nobody else has any sort of aggressive dates on this whatsoever. But is this really a huge deal? I mean, how much money could be made out of this? Well, if you're talking $2.5 billion a year from New York alone, just from the United States, you're looking at tens of billions of dollars worth of revenue. And if you're providing power to the world, that increases exponentially. And the Chinese, I'm pretty certain, intend to take advantage of this. And of course, I haven't even mentioned that this doesn't produce greenhouse gases. And just for fun, let's have a look at maps that have been projected as to what will happen if the sea levels keep rising the way they are. I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but nevertheless, even if it might, and by the way, look at the southern half of New Guinea, completely gone. That'll create quite a refugee crisis in Australia. And while we're at it, let's have a look at Europe and the massive new inland seas that now exist inside of Russia, not to mention large areas of northern Germany and Denmark that have now disappeared. And of course, there's this disturbing map that projects what the world might be like if our temperature goes up by 4 degrees Celsius, and we are well on our way to getting there by 2100. The yellow areas are all desert, all no longer suitable for human life, and as you can see, all of China is now engulfed in a giant desert. Maybe that's why they're spending so much money on all of this. Perhaps they actually buy it. I'm not certain if I do, but I'm not sure if I really want to take the chance either, especially when there is such a good alternative. Frankly, I'd prefer not to think about it, but then again, maybe Dr. Kardashev was right in ways that he didn't even realize. Maybe his scale starts at a 1 because that's the only way a civilization can actually survive. If they don't take advantage of the resources in their own solar system and instead expect to consume resources on their own planet, they just don't make it. So I hope this episode has demonstrated to you the obvious benefits, the game-changing benefits that the Starship represents to putting our entire source of the planet's energy into space. Just what a game changer it represents to this entire technology and the benefit it could bring to our planet. Even if you don't believe in climate change or any of the threats that that represents, just think about the revenue that the power companies of this entire planet generate for themselves right now, and how that could instead belong to companies that are moving those industries out into space, or at least offer a choice when it comes to power companies instead of them being monopolies. Imagine how big of a change that would represent. Very, very exciting future that we're looking at. But this is a 30,000 subscriber episode, so we can't have that without something else to get pissed off about. So it's time for our second installment of Angry Decrees. Given recent delays and an uncertain future with Artemis, it's entirely possible that a Russo-Chinese alliance will be able to set up a base on the moon before the ESA and NASA does, which will put them in violation of Angry Decree number 2. Don't up a 50-year lead. We've had over half a century to establish a base on the moon, and if nations like China and Russia get a base established there first, it's just gonna be embarrassing. So I hope you enjoyed our latest installment of Angry Decrees, and hopefully it's gotten all of you sufficiently angry, as I know it has me. Now we've had two things to get angry about in this particular episode, which is what I try to set about to do as often as I possibly can. The coffee cup is here still. If you want to talk about other things to be angry about, we got 30,000 subscribers now and we need 40,000. I know we can get there and we can get there soon. In the meantime, this damn thing serves its purpose. But I really would like to replace it with something else. So you know what to do. Like, subscribe, hit the bell button so you get notified every time I put out something new. And you know how to support this channel to keep me going. Obviously, as I've mentioned many times, YouTube is a fickle thing when it comes to monetization. This channel only stays up and afloat because of folks like you. Not to say that there's anything wrong right now. Everything's going fine. Just like I say, if I can add new supporters, it would be a wonderful thing because my old supporters need not be expected to continue to support this channel on an ongoing basis forever. We need new blood so that they can maybe take a break if they want to. In any event, until we're ready to take a huge step forward as far as generating energy for the future of our species and the future of our planet, and to actually export energy production, this huge industry, into space using the best spacecraft for the job, the SpaceX Starship, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.